Welcome to our fourth and final lecture of the 27th MFRU, IFCA. Our guest lecturer is Steve Fuller, PhD, Auguste Comte Professor of Social Epistemology at the University of Berwick. Originally trained in history, philosophy, and sociology of science, Fuller is author of 25 books, which most recently have covered visions of a trans and post-human future and a current post-truth condition. In his lecture entitled How Artificial Intelligence Generated Art Can Expand and Even Explode Our Conceptions of Art, Culture, and Aesthetics, he will take a more open approach to the question of artificial intelligence generated art, focusing on the light it shines on the limitations of how we have tended to think about art, culture, and aesthetics. Please.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this introduction and for inviting me to speak. What I'm going to do, because in a sense, what I want to get at is something that's very contemporary and where what we can do about it in terms of artificially intelligent generated art, right, is kind of an open issue. So, for example, whether it counts as art, under what conditions does it count as art, whether, as it were, artistry is attributed to the machine that generates it, to the algorithms that generate it, right? There are all these kinds of questions that they're still quite open in terms of how we determine them. And what I would like to do in the lecture is to kind of get into this topic in a way that I often find very, very easy to do, in the sense it's easy to present. It's easier to present this way. And that is to think about this historically, about where we have come from to the point that we're now at AI-generated art. In other words, where have we come from with regard to our thinking about art and aesthetics, right, over the past 2,500 years that leads us now to the kinds of issues that we're raising about AI-generated art. Okay, so this is kind of the way in which I want to proceed. And of course, we go back to the beginning, and I want to put what we find in the beginning, if we're looking at Plato and Aristotle and these people in the ancient period with regard to art, right, there is basically two conceptions, and my interest here is not necessarily in saying that one conception belongs to one thinker and another conception belongs to another thinker. That's not really what I'm getting at. I'm trying to get at some kind of ideal types or paradigms of ways of thinking about art that have had a lot of influence over the past 2,500 years. Okay, now one idea, which I do associate with Aristotle, is in some sense that art completes nature. Okay, and so one kind of imagines that there is a kind of natural course of things, right? Nature has, as it were, its own sort of logic, its own mode of development, but that there is a role for art in some way completing it, and it can complete it in several different ways. But one of the primary characteristics, right, of however one completes nature in art, right, is that it has to be faithful to nature, right? And you know, we can talk about what this faithfulness means. You know, of course, there's this word mimesis, which is often translated as imitation or representation, right? And that is definitely part of what's going on with regard to Aristotle. And this is as Aristotle's view becomes more widely taken up in the Christian Middle Ages, in particular, there is a very active kind of discussion about the limits of art and the extent to which art is natural, right? And to say, you know, art is actually sufficiently faithful to nature and not in some distorting or perverting nature. Okay, and so all of that kind of thinking comes out of the sort of general, what I would regard as kind of Aristotelian way of doing things. And then there is this other view, which I associate with Plato, but again, it's not exclusive to him, and it's not kind of the only view he has about art. But I would associate this view with the idea that in some sense, art is about the realization of an idea in matter. Okay? So in other words, what we're talking about here, where we're beginning the discussion of art in this case, is we're beginning it in terms of an idea, right? And actually, it's interesting about how we're to think about this idea. I don't think we, if we're talking about Plato, we're not thinking about the idea as a psychological thing in the narrow sense that I think we would normally think about idea in the modern period, right? We're thinking about idea as kind of a transcendental form, okay? And that in some sense, what artistry does is in some way embody the transcendental form in a material condition, okay? And this is certainly kind of the notion of art that you sort of see in the development of Christianity with regard to God's creative capacity, okay? And so now, of course, when we get Christian period, and especially when we get into the period, again, influenced by Neoplatonism, Plotinus, these kinds of people, right? That we start to think about the form, right, as logos, and logos, for purposes of this argument, right, could be thought about as a kind of prototype for our understanding of what an algorithm might be. Okay, and so what we have in the Platonic tradition, this idea, right, that art begins with an idea. The idea, in a way, can be characterized as logos, right, and then there is the issue of the material embodiment of the logos. Okay, and from the standpoint of theology, right, this is kind of how creation happens, and certainly in Christian theology. And so this is a very important, alternative view in a way, because it starts from the creator standpoint, the idea, right, rather than starting from nature. Okay, and so these two kind of conceptions of art coexist, and down through the ages, and there is it has lots of interesting kinds of consequences. So, for example, when we get to the period of let's say the later part of the Middle Ages, right? We start. So this is the period of the Middle Ages where the Aristotelian view is really beginning to dominate a lot, and what we begin to get is a kind of what should we say? A sort of proscription, a sort of prohibition on the idea of pure art. Pure art. Now, what is pure art under these circumstances? Pure art is an art that in some way does not begin with nature, but rather kind of begins, you might say, from scratch, right? Pure art in that sense. So this is the kind of thing that in the ages would have been performed by magicians, alchemists, right? The people, thought of themselves as in some way reverse engineering creation. Okay, so these guys are in a way sort of renegade or radical Platonists of a sort, right? These alchemists and magicians, right? They're people who go back to the source, and they, as it were, try to get access to the logos. And so what they're going to do then is try to reinvent the world from first principles. And by the way, this is, of course, right? Alchemy and magic, are often seen by historians of science, and this is where I pointed out in the introduction, right? See in magic and alchemy the roots of modern science, because what is modern science about? Modern science is about getting to the fundamentals in the sense of the laws, the fundamental units, the atoms, if you will, right? Getting into that kind of stuff, in some way manufacturing the world out of it. Right? And one can manufacture it, you might say, hypothetically, like Newton does, right? Newton is not literally reinventing the world. Newtonian mechanics, in a way, is a picture of how God might have done it, right? And of course, when we move into other sciences like chemistry and so forth, right, those are much closer to the idea of pure art, right? In the sense that you end up manufacturing stuff that didn't exist before, right? Synthetic materials, right? These are things that are, as we could say, man-made, right? And so in that sense, they are pure art. Okay, and in the late Middle Ages, this was very much kind of prescribed, right? So the people who were understood as doing this kind of stuff were often locked up and all the rest of it. Okay, and it's really only when you get into the early modern period, right? So we're talking about the 17th century and especially the 18th century, that people start to accept sort of this idea. And indeed, when you get to the 18th century, right, the period that we call the Enlightenment, what you end up finding kind of a sort of reversal taking place, whereby art is valued more than nature, right? Art gets valued more than nature. And this has a lot to do with the kind of sense of human self-empowerment that's going on at the time. And the Enlightenment was much about that. And here, I want to alight on one particular figure from the 18th century, who I think is kind of important for as we go forward. And again, it may be a figure that people are quite familiar with, but I'm never quite sure, to be honest with you, just how much of the history of aesthetics people remember or know or whatever. But this is Gotthold, okay, who in 1766, right? So Gotthold Less, in Germany, where I am at the moment, right? He's regarded as one of the great stylists of the German language. He was a very famous dramatist at the time. He was very famous, in particular, for dramatizing a lot of intellectual and theological disputes, right? That would have been very difficult to talk about in the open space and in the public sphere. He put them on the stage and ended up, enabling people to see some fairly provocative ideas, right, which became very much the hallmark of the Enlightenment. He's often seen as the person responsible, for example, for the idea of monotheism, where monotheism is kind of this understanding that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are actually kind of spiritual kindred, the kindred spirits, and that they're not really as radically different as they're made out to be. Okay. So this is the guy we're talking about. And in 1766, he wrote this essay called Laocoon. Okay, and so Laocoon refers to in the story of the fall of Troy, right, where the Greeks conquer Troy in the Trojan War. You know that story from the ancient epics. Laocoon is the high priest of Troy, who says, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. You know that phrase, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. Yeah. This is about the Trojan horse. And Laocoon's the man who puts his finger on the Trojan horse, but to no avail, because nobody listens to him. Okay? And so once Troy falls, and this is a story that is recounted, I believe, initially in the Aeneid, right? The Virgil's Aeneid, which is the great epic story about the founding of Rome, right? It has right? So Aeneid is someone who kind of goes from the Trojan War and then sails over to Italy, basically. And so the story of Laocoon is actually told in a very clear and very vivid way in that epic, not in Homer, but in the Aeneid. And of course, there's been lots of other representations of Laocoon, and the fate, because the fate of Laocoon basically is that, right, once Troy is falling, right, the gods send these serpents, which end up engulfing him and his sons and basically squeeze them to death. And there's this very famous statue in the Vatican, right, that is all about that. And not only is there that, right, there's also various pieces of music, some of which were written in the 17th and 18th centuries, that are also about this episode. So what you've got basically is you've got this episode, which is represented in several different media, right? This is the point, right? You've got Laocoon all over the place. And so the thing that Lessing is talking about here, which I think is quite interesting, is that Lessing objects to the way in which this kind of emerging culture of art critics. So this is the 18th century is the period where the word critic that we associate with the art critic and later with the social critic, right, comes into play, right? It's in the late 18th century. It comes out of Germany, Lessing is objecting to the way in which his contemporaries are talking about this stuff, because he doesn't like the idea that you can rank order arts, right? Because so some people are saying, well, you know, if you want to talk about this episode of Laocoon, then it ought to be poetry, or it ought to be painting, or it ought to be sculpture, or it ought to be music, right? And that there's a kind of hierarchy of which of the media best represent the particular episode. And Lessing's point is that's the wrong way to go. And you see, the people who were doing the rank ordering, right, were people who were very much wedded to a certain kind of Aristotelian way of thinking about art, right? Namely, the nature of the episode, right, lends itself to one kind of representation rather than another kind of representation, and therefore you can order the different types of representation. And Lessing says, no, that's not the way to go, right? Lessing's point is that every medium that we might talk about has its own functionalities, as we would put it in the modern period, right? That in a way they're sort of suited for representing certain aspects of anything, right? And so if you want to, you know, so depending on what exactly you want to get across about what you're depicting, right, then you might go for one medium rather than another medium. Now, Lessing had his own views about, you know, which medium you ought to use to talk about what kinds of things, right? But to me, that's not so relevant. What's relevant is the idea that in some sense, when we're talking about art, we're talking about the exploitability of the medium, right? In other words, the medium is the key thing, right? And so in other words, if you're going to paint, right, how can you exploit the medium of painting, right, with regard to a certain idea so that it has maximum effect in that medium? Now, this is very modern, okay? This is a very modern way to go. And of course, you know, if you think about the way in which the various artistic media developed over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, and of course to this day, right, you get this kind of, what should we say, extremification, right? This tendency for the media to be kind of exploited to the farthest extent that it can, right? And of course, you know, if you're talking about music, you end up with Schoenberg. If you're talking about novels, you end up with Joyce, right? If you're talking about painting, you end up with Picasso, right? I mean, this is kind of what we're talking about, where we're talking about the exploitation of the medium. Now, so Lessing's kind of important, I think, for putting that kind of idea on the table, which I think is very, very relevant one when we think about artificial intelligence as a new medium, okay? As a new medium, what can it do? Now, I want to add another point here, and this is to get us to the 20th century, and to talk about Marshall McLuhan, okay? Now, Marshall McLuhan is the great media theorist, Canadian media theorist, and you know, he's famous for all of these slogans like the medium is the message. Well, the one that I want to focus on here is the idea that old media is the content of new media, right? This is something from McLuhan. Old media is the content of new media. Now, what he's talking about there is a kind of way in which we relate to each other historically, right? Because in a sense, what Lessing gives us is the idea that each medium has its own kind of potential to be exploited as art, right? So we're leaving nature behind, basically. We're leaving nature behind entirely. And what we're talking about is the exploitability, right, of the different artistic media that are available. And what McLuhan is adding to this story is the idea that there is a kind of historical relationship between the media, right? So that the old media becomes the content of the new media. And the new media, of course, is the ascendant media, okay? You know, so, you know, when we talk about television, you look at what is the content of television. Well, the content of television is the kind of stuff that used to be done in dramas and in radio and so forth, right? And that's the content of television, right? So that old media is the content of that new medium, right? That's kind of the McLuhan idea. Now, McLuhan, right, didn't really have anything very interesting to say about computers and artificial intelligence and all that. In fact, the few things he did say about computers tended to focus very much on on what people in the 1960s and 70s were largely focused on, which was the idea of miniaturization, right? The whole idea that you might have, the Encyclopedia Britannica on your wristwatch, right? It was kind of like that. Basically, they didn't really think much beyond what we would now call the smartphone. They didn't quite think about the exact revolution this would have in the way we conceptualize things. But it seems to me that when we're talking about artificial intelligence, which is to talk about the autonomy of the computer-based medium, right? That then, the content of that medium, right, is all the media that went before it. Okay. Now, this obviously includes art, right? And so this thing gets us to the point about AI-generated art, because there are two ways to think about AI-generated art as we begin the discussion, right? I mean, one way would be to say, well, AI-generated art, in some sense, has to meet the standard of non-AI generated art, i.e. art generated by human beings, right? And I think a lot of people sort of operate on that assumption. I think this is wrong, okay? But you could see where people are coming from, right? In some sense, they're sort of imagining that, some way in which they imagine art has been done since time immemorial, right, has to be the way in which art is done. If you look at the kinds of objections that are put out there to AI-generated art, if you really scrutinize what they think art is and how art is produced, you realize these people have fairly historically stereotyped notions of how it actually happens, right? Because anyone who studies the history of art, as a practice, right, will know, first of all, that yes, sometimes there's like the sole genius who comes up with stuff, right, out of his head, as it were. But that's not really how it happens. A lot of the time, there's usually lots of draftsmen and other people in the sidelines who are contributing tremendously. And very often the artist, right, isn't in some way inventing ideas out of scratch in a literal sense, but rather is putting together stuff that has been gathered from other places, right, obviously inspired by various things, right? And so when you actually get down to the business of analyzing artistic practice as it has actually happened, in the so-called non-AI generated art, the human generated art, you realize that it's really, it's not quite this kind of act of genius thing that provides this enormous standard that AI then has to meet. Okay, and this is why, if you had a look at my abstract, why I am very skeptical about a lot of the criteria that are proposed to judge AI-generated art, because basically humans wouldn't be able to pass it, right? Individual humans wouldn't be able to pass it. If what we're comparing individual humans with, right, are somehow individual machines or individual algorithms or whatever, right? I mean, that individual humans would not necessarily be able to pass it, okay? So I do think that there's a sense in which, if we're going to think about AI-generated art in the first instance, this is why we actually need to know something about the history of art as it's actually, transpired over the last 2,500 years to get to where we are now. Because if you don't, then it seems to me, if you don't know that history, you're not going to be able to really, kind of see where the real challenge is and what might be just a bogus challenge to AI-generated art, okay? So that's one point. However, the point that I think is a more interesting and more challenging point that artificial intelligence does is, if you take the McLuhan point seriously, right? That the old media is the content of the new media, and in this case, the new media is artificial intelligence. And so in some sense, all this artificial intelligence potentially swallows up, right, incorporates, right, all of the previous media. And this is certainly a prospect, right? This is certainly a prospect. And already we have seen, of course, the way in which, so I think about this most easily in the case of music, right? Because music has undergone an enormous kind of media transformation in my lifetime, where when I was a kid, I was a disc jockey actually when I was at university, and this is like 45 years ago maybe. You know, back then we had vinyl records, and there was a lot, you know, of there was a lot of what you might call an aesthetic about vinyl. Still exists today among people. You know, there's something about the purity of the sound, right? And it has to do with the medium in which the recording is taking place, right? This vinyl stuff, okay? And the way the vinyl makes the grooves and all of that. Now, of course, we then gradually moved, right, over the course of, you know, the last 40 years, right? We moved into CDs, right? We move into MP3, right? I mean, you know, we move into all of these different kind of media transformations. And of course, you know, the consequence is that a lot of people's sensibility about what is, you know, good quality music, right? You know, so a lot of stuff that perhaps might have been seen as artificial in the past nowadays is actually is seen as very desirable and aesthetically pleasing, right? And a lot of stuff that in the past would have been a mark of authenticity is now seen as perhaps somewhat less than good quality performance. And so there is this kind of shifting normative sensibility that goes on as the media, you know, as you start to get different generations of media incorporating all the old stuff, okay? You start to get a shifting normative sensibility. And I think, you know, with artificial intelligence, this artificially intelligent art, I think, has the potential to do that too, okay? In other words, the way that we end up judging all kinds of art ends up being, in a way, dictated by the nature of the medium through which we experience this art. And so this raises then very interesting point about the range of artificial intelligence in terms of, you know, as a kind of framework within which one incorporates art. Because artificial intelligence potentially is quite vast in its incorporation. Okay, so let me give you an example of something that I've been thinking about a lot, because I have a PhD student who's working on this, so I have a PhD student from Korea who works for UNESCO. Okay, and UNESCO, as you know, is very much concerned with the preservation of the world's cultural heritage, right? And, you know, preservation of art is very much part of that. And they're now grappling, UNESCO is now grappling with this issue of artificial intelligent generated art, right? And what the standing of that is exactly, okay? And so there are many different questions that arise in this context. Now, what's interesting is one of the questions that arises is the standing of virtualizations of already existing art. Okay, so we've got art out there, right? And you know, this already exists, of course. But think about it. So we've got art in the Louvre, let's say in Paris or whatever, the Tate Gallery in London, right? We've got all of these works of art, right? They're there, right? But of course, most of these major art galleries have now developed virtual versions of themselves, right? Online versions that people can visit as well, and so forth. The question then becomes whether this is something that UNESCO, first of all, should be encouraging, right? So in other words, in some way, UNESCO might be promoting this as a general practice across the world, virtualization of all, you know, concrete works of art, right? That's one possibility, right? Or is it, you know, should virtualization just be treated as a kind of convenience? In other words, it is not, as it were, a necessary feature of the preservation of the world's cultural heritage. Okay, so this then goes to the question of what is it that's valuable in art, and where does the value exactly come from? Because one of the people who tend to be skeptical about virtualization, and there are a lot of skeptics out there, you know, and basically see the idea of going to a virtual art gallery, right, where there's a real art gallery out there already, right, as being, you know, kind of a convenience, but not all that substantial, you might say, as from an ontological standpoint, if you will, right? And not that substantial. It's just a kind of convenience. The real thing is still in the original galleries, right? People who think that way tend to have what I would regard as a very kind of proprietary notion of art. Okay, and what I mean by proprietary is the idea that what makes something art, right, the uniqueness of the art comes from the uniqueness of the thing rather than the uniqueness of the form. Okay, it comes from the uniqueness of the thing, that is to say, the concrete thing, right? And everything else is just a pale representation of it, right? And there are a lot of people who think about the virtual that way, and so as a result, they don't want to give too much credit to artificially intelligent arts that can, a program, so for example, an algorithm that could generate an entire art gallery, right? That can, give you the Tate, give you the Louvre, right? That they don't want to credit that too much because they say there's still the real thing out there. Others, of course, depending again what you think is the art, where does the art lie exactly, right? They believe that in fact, actually, this virtualization stuff, in a way, kind of gets not only at the uniqueness of the art, because you're still, you're still producing all of these artworks, right? But it also gets to the universality of the art, because the only way in which all of this wonderful art that's supposedly part of the world's cultural heritage, the only way people are going to get access to this, right, is going to be if it's virtualized, right? I mean, it's pretty unlikely, right, that you're going to have large percentages of the world's population, right, going even to the most popular art galleries in the world. And so if you actually do believe that art is part of the world's cultural heritage, and that in some sense you have to be able to maximize access to the art, then virtualization is actually an incredibly good way to do it, especially if there are enormous difficulties in reaching the locations where the art is normally found. And the difficulties may be because of the geographical stuff, but there could also be political reasons why it's hard to get to these places. And in a way, virtualization overcomes that, right? And does so it thinks about this as in a legitimate fashion, because what is being virtualized in each of the cases are distinct pieces of art, right? So there are standards by which need to be generated. Okay. Now this becomes a real live issue for UNESCO in particular, because then it hits upon another aspect of their remit. And this is the idea of protecting tangible and intangible assets. Okay, so art, you might say art has both, right? Art has tangible assets, which are the actual artworks, right? And UNESCO has been normally focused on that, and the cultural heritage sites. The way you get to be one of these things has to do with the way in which the locale has actually preserved, right, what the value is in the concrete sense, right? So these are the tangible assets that they're talking about protecting. But the intangible, this is where it gets interesting. The intangible, what does intangible mean? Well, I mean, the traditional definition that UNESCO has used has been the practices, the artistic practices, right? And so if we're talking about indigenous peoples, in other words, people, right, whose practices might easily become extinguished through lack of use or reproduction over time, right, that UNESCO is sort of in the business of preserving that. But of course, one could think about the intangible art assets in terms of this virtual stuff, right? That in some sense, and this is actually a point I've been pressing this on my PhD student. I don't know if she's going to buy it, but I actually think that part of what UNESCO could be in the business of doing is actually transferring the tangible to the intangible, right? In other words, it should be in the business of virtualizing. So in other words, I'm on the side of the virtualizers here, okay? And so again, it's in this mindset of talking about the old media is the content of the new media, and in this case, the new media is this artificial intelligence generated virtualization process, which in principle could be applied to all art, and then would make all art available. Not only would it make all art available, but it also provide, if you think, for those of you, if you go into the more sophisticated kind of virtual art galleries and so forth, right, you could see the art from many different angles and so forth. And indeed, it might even be possible, and this is where it gets kind of interesting with regard to the ontological boundaries of art in the virtual space, right? The idea that, for example, I go into the virtual Louvre, I see the Mona Lisa, right? And I'm looking at the Mona Lisa from many different angles. Now, maybe I want to get a snapshot of this thing, right? I want to do a virtual snapshot of this thing from the angle at which I've decided to look at it. And then I want to mess around with it, right? I want to, so in other words, I want to download it, and then I want to mess around with it with Paint Shop or whatever kind of apps you have, right, that can allow you to mess around with pictures. And as it were, engage in the creative process myself. Okay. Now you see, this is kind of tricky. What's going on when you do something, if you allow that to happen, right? Is that, as it were, encouraging a kind of efflorescence of artistry, right? Where you basically have people kind of appropriating all these artworks and changing them in all these kind of interesting ways, at least from their standpoint, maybe posting them online, whatever, right? Does this actually encourage, the spread of art, right? Or does it in some way defile art, right? In some way kind of debases art. And see, this is where the issue of the uniqueness of the concrete object comes back to haunt us, right? And some of you may know, right, in the 1920s, I believe, Walter Benjamin, right, the critic from the Frankfurt School, right, he wrote this famous article called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, right, where he talks about, with regard to postcards and photographs and things like this, which are becoming very mainstream, right, in the post-World War I period. He's talking about how this removes the aura, what he calls the aura, the halo, right, of art, because in a sense, everyone seems to have have their bit of it, right? I've got my postcard, like I've been there, right, done that, been there, done that, right, and photographs and all this kind of stuff. And in some way, the kind of mystique of art is somehow debased precisely because it is made so readily available. Okay, I don't share this view. But this is a very powerful view that's still out there. I think this kind of a view is ultimately about, it's about property, basically. I think it's a proprietary notion of art. And I think it's one that I think ends up creating a kind of, it adds unnecessarily to the mystique of the genius, okay, as the creator of art. Because it, again, focuses on the singularity of the connection between the person who supposedly produced the art and the art being produced, and nobody else is involved. Okay, and I think this is this is a mystique that needs to be dissipated, and you see, artificial intelligence in a way is a way to do that, right? It is a way to do that because we've got these artificially intelligent machines, right, and everybody knows they've got to be programmed. Right, so it's not like the machine, machine may be programmed to program itself, and that is very interesting from the standpoint of giving you an operational definition of creativity, right, in a sense that could compete with the human notion of creativity. But the point is, when you actually look at what we're talking about with artificial intelligence, we are obviously have a very demystified view to begin with of how art is actually going to be produced. Because it's going to require programmers, right? These programmers might be informed by aestheticians or art historians or whatever, right? And they're going to then program this machine. This machine's going to generate this stuff, right? And then somebody's going to judge, right, whether it's art or not, right? So this is a very mechanical process. There's no other way to describe it, right? It's quite clear what's going on. And this demystifies. It really does. But it seems to me that I don't think we have to worry about that too much. Yes, it demystifies, but demystification does not destroy the artistry, okay? It does not destroy the artistry. I think where things get even more interesting, with regard to artificial intelligence generated art is when we think about it in terms of creating works that never existed before, right? So in other words, we're not just talking about the AI's ability to generate virtual galleries that allow people to see art that already exists, but that in some sense, right, that we might actually think about artificial intelligence as generating its own art. And at the moment, the way this tends to get conceptualized, right, is to imagine it very much in a kind of Turing test mode. If you know about the Turing test, right, the Turing test, named after Alan Turing, right, is this kind of idea of the sorts of questions, a kind of protocol, right, that you would provide to be able to determine whether a human or a machine generated something. Right? What would you be looking for to tell the difference? Right? And the point is, if you've got this protocol and you still can't tell the difference, then the machine passes, right? In other words, in this case, the machine produces art. If you can't tell the difference between whether the art is produced by a human or a machine, right? And we're talking about bringing in the experts, right? The art critics, the art historians, right? The estheticians, all these people who supposedly know what art is. Right? You bring people in and they can't tell the difference, then it passes, right? This is the Turing test. And when you look at it that way, that's interesting, that's challenging. And we've already seen instances where the machines pass. So it's not like, we're talking about the future here. I mean, it's already happening. It's just whether people want to give it the significance that it deserves. But I think there's a kind of larger issue on the horizon with regard to this idea of AI generated art that is, as it were, original art original to the AI, is that you might actually think about artificial intelligence as a way of doing art, right? I mean, this is the point, right? So in other words, it isn't just simply about the art, the AI somehow matching a state where the AI is thought of as kind of an agent, like the artistic agent, but rather the AI, artificial intelligence becomes a kind of medium, like painting and sculpture and and all these other artistic media, right? Artificial intelligence, so in other words, to put it bluntly, right, an artist of the future might have to be someone who knows how to program algorithms. Okay, that would be, as it were, a kind of artistic endeavor. That would be working in a certain kind of artistic medium. And indeed, it might be working in an artistic medium that ends up incorporating all the other artistic media. Okay, so this has the potential to actually be quite strong, right? And so then you get this idea that you can be, as it were, generating forms of art in virtual space, perhaps, right, that don't exist in any concrete form. Okay, and so then the issue becomes, okay, UNESCO wants to protect these things, right, these virtual things, then what is their standing, right? If we're talking about AI generated art that in some way has no concrete correlate but just exists entirely in virtual space, right? Do we count this as tangible or intangible, right, from the UNESCO standpoint? And that's where it gets interesting. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the distinction is going to fall apart, and that in a sense, things are just migrating to what we call the intangible, okay? And that art is going to be, in some sense, a kind of algorithmically generated thing. It's going to be kind of, in a way, like what these Platonists were talking about 2,000 years ago with regard to the logos as being the driving force of creation, that then, as it were, finds its form of embodiment, right? And that is the execution of the program. And that then, the product of that is the art, okay? That's kind of where I see this is going in the long term. But at this point, I think I should stop because it's about 45 minutes and I want to leave it open for people who have questions, because I think I've said a lot of things that might provoke you or interest you. But I want to thank you for your attention.
Okay, that was really intensive. Thank you.
Okay, are there questions?
Thank you very much. It was really interesting and very, yes. Any questions, maybe?
I thank you very much for your lecture. Maybe I have more a comment than a question or something to start a debate that I would be interested in. So I was wondering why, in the beginning, you were explaining about this emphasis on the media, and you took Marshall McLuhan, and so this definition of art, also to divide it from this interest for nature. And actually what you spoke about was, I would say this was the self-referential sort of art, ontological sort of art that is concerned with questioning the medium in which it operates. So, which would be modern or modernist art in particular. So, but could be also a little bit widened, so that you could say that this actually begins with Baroque, let's say, with the, so to say, the establishment of the sign, if you follow Foucault, for instance. But then you didn't mention, for instance, performativity. So then you spoke about this uniqueness and the object in the gallery, and you were concerned with this virtual space, actually, of the gallery support. So what about performative dimension of art? Not only performances, but art that is performative as something that is crucial, and not the emphasis on the objects, on the artifacts, on the products and so forth, but on this doing. Now, in the end, you were speaking now about doing art. So I think you came a bit close to that with this algorithmic form of art. That would be one common question, so to say. And then
can I answer that? And
yeah, sure,
bring
please.
the second one.
And I would have.
Yeah, because I think we only have a few people here, so
yeah, sure.
We can take our time.
Yes.
I think you raise a very good point, okay, about the performativity. If you recall, I was earlier. I made a reference to the possibility that if you're in a virtual gallery, right, and you're looking at, let's say, a painting from many different angles, and you download the angle from which you're looking at it, and then you play with it, right? You work with it, right? This kind of gets at where I think the virtualization. So the virtualization encourages performativity, I think, and this is kind of what scares some people, right? That there's a sense in which if you're able to interact with these because you can interact with virtual spaces a lot more easily than you can interact with the concrete space. It's easier to protect the concrete space in some sense, right? But the virtual spaces, if you're able to download stuff, right, and then mess around with it, right, in a sense, everyone can start becoming involved in the artistic process. And then the artwork, in a sense, takes on, just becomes kind of a trace through which a lot of different kinds of transformations and so forth are taking place. So everybody looks at the Mona Lisa, they download it from the angle at which they look at it, and then they play around with it. And then what's the relationship between all of that stuff and the original Mona Lisa, right? In a sense, it looks like the Mona Lisa starts to acquire a life of its own. It becomes almost like an organism that's developing in many different kinds of ways. And I think that that sense of performativity, right, where it is no longer a static relationship with the object, but rather a kind of involvement, a participation, right, in the in the development, if you will, of the object. I think that actually is very much allowed by the virtualization, and I think it's one of the things that, in fact, scares people about it, is that, in a sense, it does open up a much more performative relationship to all art media, right? To all art media, so that's how I would deal with that issue. So I'm very sympathetic to the performativity stuff, okay? And I think virtualization helps it a lot.
Okay, but so you now touched upon another issue, and that is participatory aspect of art, and you put quite a great emphasis to it. And this is the other question that I wanted to address here. So this participatory mode, And you ended up with something, a suggestion, so to say, that the artist of the future would be the one who is able to handle algorithms. So one provocative question would be then, like with Willem Flusser, you know that he had some considerations about biotechnology in the late 80s. And he was wondering about the future of the art, and he said something similar, that the future artist would be the biotechnologist. So where is then the difference between biotechnologists and the artist? And here, the programmer and the artist.
No, you're right. I mean, God, you've now opened up a whole kind of can of worms here, okay? I am sympathetic with that point of view, right? That there is a sense in which when we're talking about the creation of synthetic life, where we are manipulating genomes, right? And as it were, creating forms of life that never existed before by switching genomes around and stuff like that, that is art, yes. So that is true. That is art. And I also think, and actually this is where where I first actually began to think about this, believe it or not, was about the way in which early neuroscientists regarded the brain, right? And here what I'm thinking about is the way in which this probing stuff, right? When they used to put the electrodes into the brain to see just what would happen, right? And where a lot of this stuff was extremely experimental, and where what part of the motivation for it was that in some sense the brain had this kind of untapped potential, right? That if we actually fiddled around with it a bit, right, we would be able to unleash. And again, I think this is very much in the same kind of mode of exploiting the medium. In this case, the medium being the brain, right? That in some sense you're poking around in, kind of like a lot of this kind of experimental music was doing, right? In the same period, in the middle third of the 20th century. And so, yes, I'm kind of sympathetic to that, actually. I realize it scares a lot of people, but yes, I'm on that wavelength. I think from this standpoint, the artificial intelligence stuff is kind of mild by comparison from the standpoint of ethics, right? I mean, with artificial intelligence, the questions are primarily about, aesthetic sensibility. But when we start to talk about the idea of creating life and thinking that as art, or messing around with brains and thinking about that as art, right? Then we open up a whole bunch of ethical issues here. But I do think as we become more capable, right, of getting into these things, right, as we know more, that in a sense this distinction between art and science is going to collapse, and it's all going to kind of become art in a way. That's kind of where I think it's getting.
Thank you. I don't know. Now we don't have that much time to discuss, but I really wouldn't agree.
Okay. But I think you understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah, sure. I understand, and I agree with this point. That I understand this point that you're making about this experimental openness, so that you understand art in this sense of probing and being open to this experimentation, whatever comes out. But what I would emphasize, on the other hand, is that science is often, or usually, with all these funding systems and so forth, linked to very strong interests.
Well, that's true.
So it's not so naive research and experimentation. And art, on the other hand, it is taking over, no, I won't say responsibility, but it's looking for maybe also ethical issues and addressing those. For instance, Adam Zaritsky, I don't know if you know him. He's a very interesting artist, controversial, so to say. I wrote an article about his work because he's doing transgenesis and things like that. So he's very much into science, but he's very provocative with using scientific methods and protocols and so forth.
Can you send me your? Is it in English?
Yes, I can send it to you. I'm
interested in this stuff.
Yes, thank you. So this is something to discuss. So I think, for instance, Flusser didn't really make a distinction between these two profiles, so to say, the artist and the scientist. So I don't know. I'm taking over all the space for the discussion. I'm sorry.
No, it's interesting. No. You raised a very important point that was kind of in the background. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
maybe I can because we touched upon this thing also, the participatory aspect of art. Wouldn't you say, and this has to do with this programming, so to say, when you have a program of something, then you have a kind of a platform, somebody designs it, and then also the example that you described with Mona Lisa, so everybody is somehow then linked to it and maybe brings something in, and the things then evolves and so forth. But isn't it in the beginning, initially, some kind of program, something that is already what we could say framework, some kind of framework, that direction or something that is pre-prepared, that doesn't really allow to go out and to really open it to these other people. So everybody does what is already predicted in this system, in this.
So you're talking about the way in which algorithms are designed?
I mean, it's a general question about participatory, participation. For instance, because Slavoj Žižek then made a criticism about participation in contemporary society, saying that it is actually false participation, so to say, because we are constantly called to take part, to express our opinions, to be there, to be part of it, so forth. But actually, always you have some platforms where you're just put in, and your perspective is predefined, so to say. It's expected. So you are within a framework. So I think here with this programming thing, maybe this problem repeats, so that all these people who are there and contribute with this creativity, it's not some creativity that would be, it's not outside of this framework of the program and the apparatus actually that is there. Everybody is within.
Yes. Okay. So you're certainly correct that there is no guarantee that going down this route, this kind of route I'm talking about, will give you the participatory stuff. I'm imagining kind of a very generous definition, because you can easily imagine ways in which this can be constrained, right? That the participation can be constrained. It can be constrained, for example, in terms of the ability of people to download images that they see in virtual galleries, right? I'm operating on the assumption people would be able to download the images. Maybe you wouldn't be able to download images unless you pay for them. Maybe the images that you download cannot be changed, right? I mean, there are all these ways in which the participation can be stopped all along the way within this kind of artificial intelligence framework. I would have thought one of the things that would be very interesting, because look, the potential for algorithms, if we're just looking at what algorithms are capable of doing, minus where the policy, right? Algorithms self-program over time, right? And in some sense, this could even be virtual gallery programming over time, right? And so in other words, when you go to, in principle, right, the next time you visit the same virtual gallery, it may be quite different in the way it's constituted in terms of the kind of art objects that are there and the ways you can interact with them. Algorithms do have the capability, right, in principle, to allow that kind of fluidity and participation. The question is whether it will happen, right? And this is where all the politics enters into it. And because what I think would be really regrettable, given that this algorithmic space opens up a kind of freedom that previously didn't exist in other media, I think it would be very regrettable if we end up reproducing the constraints of the old media, right? And I think this is what your worry is, that we will do that, right? We will kind of basically reproduce in this algorithmic space all the constraints that have existed in the previous media. I hope that doesn't happen, right? But I think this is where, but I think it's really important, though, that people who are interested in the future of art to get enthusiastic about this algorithmic stuff and campaign for its openness. Because I think if people interested in art kind of take a kind of distant view on artificial intelligence and are kind of a bit skeptical about whether it generates art and, have all these kinds of problems, right, then they're not going to get sufficiently involved to want to keep it as open as it can be, okay? And so that's where I really think that the art people need to embrace this and kind of make it their own, to try to prevent as much as possible this kind of foreclosure that you're talking about.
Okay. I think it's a question that is. I agree that important that the artists address it. And I had more in mind, like Claire Bishop, Claire Bishop, was claiming that participatory art is really something that is opening space for art to be political, to address actual issues and so forth. So you would have not the art with artificial intelligence as cases of projects that she would discuss, for instance, but more projects that would be inviting people to maybe contribute their viewpoints and things like that. So in that case, it depends on how you ask them what's the topic and so forth. So you actually establish a framework. In that case, I was in that situation. But it's something just to it's interesting to compare and to think further.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you. No problem.
Okay. So, you have any questions more? So, I will really thank you for this lecture.
Well, thank you. Thanks my interlocutor down there. Yes, thank you too.
I wanted to send this one to Alexandra. Thank you for
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was really nice and to hear you both. It's interesting. Okay.